So one of the biggest issues I currently have with Diablo 4 is something that I think may be being addressed in the near future. And if I would have to guess, this is going to be fixed or addressed in the expansion coming in 2026. And that big issue is being item locked or power locked. And what I mean by that is that currently in Diablo 4, a lot of our build customization and build creation is heavily dependent on what legendary aspects you're using and what unique items you're using. But the really big issue with this is these are also two of the main things that have been continuing to be added through every new season. Usually with every new season, we get a handful of new uniques and a handful of new legendary aspects. And even going into the current season of season 9, we're actually getting a ton of aspects reworked, seeming like a lot of the more useless ones are now actually going to be really strong. And this doesn't really sound like an issue until you realize that most of the builds in the game don't have a ton of options because so many of their slots are already taken up by things that are either a requirement for a build to actually function or are just a legendary aspect that's so strong and gives you so much power that it's also pretty much a requirement. Like I mainly play the druid and so many druid builds are like this. Let's take for instance a pulverized build. Well, with pretty much every pulverized build, you need the legendary aspect that makes your pulverize also have a big shockwave that you pretty much always put on your weapon, because then that will massively increase the damage of that shockwave from the pulverize compared to the normal pulverized damage, which is what you're already scaling. Pretty much every druid build uses the legendary aspect where you deal multiplicatively increased damage based upon your fortify. It's up to like 75%. And this is most commonly put on your necklace to get even more out of it. And pretty much every druid build has easy access to fortify, so that's another requirement. Then most builds have a handful of unique items that are a requirement for the build to actually work. Then when you add in mythics that aren't necessarily required for builds to work, but just give you so much power that a couple of them, like Shroud of the False Death chest piece, are just so incredibly strong that they're basically a requirement because of the amount of power you give. Like +1 to all passives from that mythic chest piece could literally be the only thing on the chest piece and it would still be worth using. All of this just to say that for almost every build in Diablo 4, a lot of your slots are not interchangeable. And that starts to become an issue because that's where a lot of our build creation comes from. But there's something that we've recently seen from a survey for Diablo 4 that could be pointing to this being changed in the future. And it's also directly comparing to the thing I've wanted in Diablo 4 since it was released. And that's the Kanai's Cube from Diablo 3. But before we explain the Kanai's Cube, let's take a look at where this was actually talked about. So there was a Diablo 4 survey that someone posted about on the official Diablo 4 forums. A bunch of other people have also gotten this survey. And this survey just goes over a ton of different things. They ask how much people would like all of these new potential systems. There was like 27 or 28 new things that they list in this. And they asked the survey takers how interested they would be in those systems. But then the second part asked about things that would keep you interested in Diablo 4. That kind of first section with all the new things they could be adding is what would kind of make you interesting in jumping into Diablo 4 or what you would want to see in the future. This one is more what would keep you in the game. Now, the option that pertains to what we're talking about is called a new power source, an alternate power system like in Diablo 3 where players can permanently, in quotation, so permanently as in it doesn't change with gear, apply an aspect from an item without having to wear it, bringing new potential twists to builds. This is exactly what I have wanted for quite a long time. And they are very obviously directly comparing this and saying it would basically be Kanai's Cube. Now, if you've never played Diablo 3 or heard about this, the Kanai's Cube in Diablo 3 does a bunch of different things, but the main thing I'm talking about for this video is kind of I think the main function for it. But essentially, there were 3 different gear slots of the Kanai's Cube. There's a weapon, armor piece, and a jewelry piece. I think it's more specific in Diablo 3, but when going to Diablo 4, it would be something like a weapon, an armor piece, and probably rings, because necklace works a little bit differently, or maybe they would do necklace. But then in Diablo 3, you would take a legendary item, so they have a legendary power. You would put in a bunch of resources with it, and you would essentially feed it to the cube. Then anytime you wanted, when you went back to the cube, you could choose between any of the powers you've sucked into the cube, and you could just apply them to the cube, and this would give you that legendary power without you having a piece of gear with that equipped. So let's say in Diablo 4, if they did this with only legendary legendary aspects, you would be able to say, apply that legendary aspect from the druid I went over that gives you a big damage increase based upon your fortify. You would be able to just take that in whichever way they did this. Most likely you would just apply it through your codex already, but you could just apply that legendary aspect to the cube. Now you don't have to worry about wearing a piece of gear with that legendary aspect, or that legendary aspect taking up a slot that could also be a unique. So it would just be in the cube, and they could give us a handful of slots like this. It would most likely be different legendary aspect slots. I'm not exactly sure if they would want to balance it around having like a weapon as one of them, because that's obviously a legendary aspect with double the power. I'm not sure if they would want to do a necklace either, because that's also a buffed up legendary aspect, but they may want to. And I do actually think that while that would add a lot of power, I think that would probably be good in my opinion. I would want weapon slot as 1, armor slot as 2, and then ring slots as 3. And the big reason I would want it like that is because something like a weapon is super important for both legendary aspects and uniques, but there are a ton of builds that have a really cool unique that would work with the build, but the legendary aspect they could say put on a two-handed weapon would just be way too strong to not use. So you don't get to use any of these uniques with more interesting effects because this legendary aspect just gives you way too much power. So having a weapon as one of the options for the Kanai's cube would probably be something that'd be just really good for opening up more builds. Then one armor piece that would just allow you to add in a defensive or more utility things. And then rings would be nice because it stops it from being a neck, and necklaces are also, I think, the most open for legendary aspects. So there may be too many options there, but rings allow you to have the resource aspects in there. So you could just have those 3 as a new system where you could apply aspects to that and free up those 3 slots. And that would open up so many new builds, or just allow you to change up pretty much every build currently in the game. It'd give you so many more options. And I do think the developers are actually going to do this. It isn't necessarily going to be the Kanai's cube. It'll probably be something pretty similar and work in a very similar way. But one of the main reasons I think that is because they can make this pretty simple. You don't have to worry about like adding in unique powers to the cube. You don't have to worry about changing up any of the legendary aspects or anything. You just give us a few of these slots where you can permanently apply legendary aspects to them, and then you're done. That's all you have to do. That's pretty simple. It doesn't get super complex or anything like that. We already have the codex that already stores all of our legendary aspects that you can just apply to it very easily. So every part about that is pretty simple, but it opens up a significant amount of potential for new builds and changing up our already existing builds. So it's very simple to understand, but the people at the higher end that are build crafters and really want to make more interesting builds, it gives them so much more complexity and interesting options. That's one of the big reasons I think they will do this. Now, I think the most probable time for this to be implemented into the game is with the 2026 expansion, so the second expansion for the game. It'll be coming early 2026, and I think a big new system like this would just be added with a new expansion. The only thing I'm iffy on is how they're going to implement it with the expansion, because they could just make it part of the bought expansion where you have to buy the expansion or you don't have access to it. But I think this system is actually way too strong for that. I think it gives way too much power. We have gotten power things from the previous expansion, like runes are pretty powerful and mercenaries give you a little bit of power, but I don't think either of those are actually as impactful as this system would be. So I actually think there's a higher likelihood of this system being added with the big free update that you get with expansions. Like the first expansion, you got all the paid expansion stuff. Then there was a ton of additional stuff that was just free coming to the game. I think it would be added with that. It would still hype up the expansion, but you wouldn't need to buy the expansion because I think this would be too much power creep that would require a payment. But this is the biggest thing I want added to Diablo 4. The amount of new builds I know I could create just specifically for the druid with just adding these 3 new slots would be absolutely ridiculous. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.